A big reason why Titan is such a notable villain in Megamind is because he served as the first real nemesis the blue alien had ever faced. Because while he and Metro Man had been sworn enemies for years, in the end their rivalry was pretty much just a sham and an elaborate game between a guy trying to satisfy his ego and somebody trying to find their purpose in life, as I went into further detail in another video, which you can find a link in the description to. So as a result, Titan was the first true threat Megamind went up against, because unlike Metro Man, Hal was not pulling his punches and wouldn't be satisfied with simply arresting him. But that being said, while it is true that Titan was most definitely Megamind's sworn enemy, the same cannot be said for Hal himself. And today, I'd like to go over who Titan's worst enemy actually was, and why Megamind couldn't even hope to compare to the amount of harm that they did to him. And as I'm obligated to say, there will be more spoilers for Megamind ahead, so if you don't want the entire movie ruined, don't proceed with this video. Okay, so to get right into it, and as I just said, Titan's worst enemy actually wasn't Megamind. He does make for a close second and was a pretty big threat once he decided to take him down, yes, but he wasn't his worst enemy or his biggest threat. And contrary to what some of you might think, it wasn't Metro Man either. Though seeing as he was probably the only one who could have actually defeated him in a straight fight, Hal was still definitely right to run away and be afraid of him all the same. Now that seemingly leaves only one other person that it could be, which is Roxanne. But somewhat surprisingly, it isn't her either. In fact, Roxanne of all people might actually be Hal's greatest ally throughout the entire movie, as she still tries to see the best in him long after everybody else has come to see him as a monster. And that's honestly a dead giveaway as to who Titan's worst enemy actually is. Hal Stewart. That's right, it was Titan himself and nobody else that was his single biggest enemy. And that's what makes Roxanne Hal's biggest ally and friend by contrast, because she repeatedly tries to save Hal from himself, even if all of her efforts are in vain. Now as for why Hal is a bigger threat to himself than Megamind could ever be, there's actually several reasons. One of which is that he's simply too lazy to actually accomplish anything. Sure, the fact that he's extremely stupid doesn't help either, but people with low intellects have often been known to still accomplish a lot through hard work and dedication. But unless video games enter the conversation, Hal never puts any real effort into anything. I mean, look at how messy his apartment is. And not to mention, the most likely reason he's a cameraman of all things is because it's relatively easy for him to do. And as I brought up in my video questioning what he saw in Roxanne, which you can also find a link in the description to, where this becomes plainly obvious is that he doesn't put any effort into trying to understand Roxanne on a personal level and instead tries to attract her using what he believes normal chicks like, as his bouncy house comment only reinforces. In other words, if Hal hadn't been so lazy and actually put effort into his attempts to woo Roxanne, things would have gone a lot better. Because either he would have actually been able to form a connection with her since he'd be making an actual effort to understand her, or more likely, he'd come to realize on his own how incompatible they are and thus be able to avoid the heartbreak he goes through either way. But instead, just because he finds her attractive and for no other real reason, he starts doing the bare minimum to flirt with her and become more than friends, and ends up coming across as a total creep as a result. And once again, though it still can't make up for the fact that they don't have much in common, a lot of what goes down could have been entirely avoided if he hadn't just been so lazy about it. But this only gets worse once he becomes Titan, as he sees no point in being a superhero because he can't, quote, gain anything from it. In other words, he's too lazy to actually do something unless there's something in it for him, and thus sees more worth in being a villain because it seemingly benefits him and he can get whatever he wants. And it's only then, when he believes he stands something to gain, that he gets the motivation to stop being lazy and actually put effort effort into doing something. It's just a shame it had to be a citywide rampage. But even then, his inner laziness still continues to show, because simply put, he would have had Megamind dead to rights at least 10 different times if he had just put in the effort to actually finish him off. But because he has a hard time finishing anything he starts, he just can't be bothered to simply punch his head into a wall, or cut him in half with his lasers, or ground pound him into the pavement. Instead, he just throws him around a lot or points his lasers in his general direction, but never actually succeeds in his task of killing him because he underestimates just how competent and resourceful Megamind actually is. Seriously, if Hal had just put an ounce of genuine effort into their final confrontation, Megamind would have been completely done for. But that also exposes one of his other biggest problems that makes him his own worst enemy: his temper. Now, unlike his laziness, just how bad and volatile Hal's anger issues are don't really become apparent until he gains superpowers, but there are still a few hints early on, most notably after Roxanne turns down his party invitation, as his response is to get angry with himself and thus isn't able to learn anything from why Roxanne rejected him. Because if he had thought about it calmly and rationally, though granted, that does actually take effort, which he's too lazy to give, he would realize that the bouncy house wasn't the problem. But because it's easier for him to get angry, that's exactly what he does. And furthermore, he also refuses to take responsibility for his own actions, as he proceeds to blame the van for hurting him when he's the one who punched it in anger. And once again, both of these things alone make it plain as day that he'd never have a chance with somebody like Roxanne. Because as I reinforced in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too, Hal is most definitely responsible for everything he does, and him alone. And his refusal to accept that is a major reason why his becoming a superhero was doomed from the start. Because as the later parts of the story only prove, when you give a man with a mentality like that the powers of a god, it's only a matter of time before he starts blaming everybody else for his problems and taking it out on them. And while I will always say that Megamind revealing everything was the single worst thing he could have done, what he really did there was simply give Hal a face to the anger he already felt towards society in general, a physical person he could project all of his anger and resentment on. And once again, it's that very refusal to accept accountability that leads him down a very dark path. Because simply put, if he hadn't chosen to be lazy and blame society for his own failings in life, then he could have gained a lot from being a superhero. After all, he had just defeated the most hated person in Metro City. The populace were already showering him with praise and practically worshipping him. At that point, Hal could have asked for anything he wanted and they would have gladly handed it to him on a silver platter. And all he'd have to do in return is save the city every once in a while from Megamind. Now, obviously, virtue is his own reward, and the fact that Hal can't understand that is also a major problem. But the fact still remains that he could have actually gotten everything he ever wanted simply by being a hero. But his anger issues and projecting it onto everybody else compelled him to just take what he wanted by force instead. And we all know how well that ended up going for him. And on top of that, his temper is also why he wasn't able to just kill Megamind to be done with it. He was just so angry with him that he couldn't think straight and thus impulsively does whatever he wants instead of clearing his head enough just to finish the job and then throw as big a tantrum as he wants now that nobody can stop him. But once again, that would require him to have an ounce of self-control, which he's too lazy and angry at that point to have. And all of this leads into yet another reason why Hal was his own worst enemy, and it's one that I just briefly mentioned: his lack of belief in virtues. Now, I've touched on this in several different videos, but a very strict moral compass is an absolute must for anybody who's put in a position of power, and Hal's lack of one should have been enough to disqualify him as a superhero contender alone, because he openly scoffs at Roxanne's belief in all that is good, is pretty much the only person not to mourn the death of Metro Man because he didn't believe in what he stood for, and sees no real point in doing anything good unless he can gain something from it. And it's that attitude that causes everything to start snowballing once he becomes Titan. As it's that even more than his laziness that motivates him to become a villain, as he just can't see the value in doing good for good's sake. Now, whether his laziness is what fuels that mindset, or his lack of belief in virtues is what motivates his lazy attitude, is hard to say. But either way, all of these different factors are not a good combination, and just scream of a man on a path to self-destruction that manifests itself once it has the power and desire to do so. But as I already said, the whole thing could have been completely avoided if it weren't for that very mindset and attitude. Because through a combination of laziness, an underlying bad temper, a penchant for blaming others for his problems, and very flexible morals, Titan not only ends up making for a bad superhero, but a bad supervillain as well, since he's way too impulsive and self-destructive to really accomplish anything beyond the most simple task. And as I've stressed many times, if he had just bothered to put the tiniest bit of effort into anything he did, but especially try and see the benefits of being a superhero beyond what he could gain from it, things could have gone very differently for him, and much better overall at that. And that's what makes Titan his own worst enemy. His refusal to take accountability and try to fix his personality flaws result in the only logical outcome possible, becoming a monster that must be stopped before he ends up destroying everything. And in the end, he has nobody to blame for it but himself, as Megamind even points out. As I even noted at the start, whatever threat Megamind posed to him is honestly dwarfed by how much of a danger he was to himself. And the fact that he ends up losing even when he has pretty much everything stacked in his favor only proves that. When all is said and done, Hal Stewart was a classic case of a miserable person who doomed himself to such a life because he simply couldn't accept that he was the problem and try to work on fixing his flaws, and became a monster as a result of it. Okay, that's everything I wanted to cover, but now I want to hear your thoughts on this. Do you believe that Hal Stewart really was his own worst enemy in Megamind, or do you believe that's ridiculous and that Megamind was clearly a bigger threat to him than Hal could ever be to himself? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And as I always say, please keep in mind that you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video just because you watched it. You can feel about Titan and his fall to villainy however you want to, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.